You numb. There was a time when life could still reach people more directly. A song could move them, a conversation could stay with them for days, a quiet sunset could actually feel quiet, a hard truth could hit the heart, a book could absorb them, a moment of grief could be felt fully, a moment of joy could feel deep, warm, and real. Now something feels different. Not for everyone, and not all the time, but for many people, life feels flatter than it should. Not always sad, not always dramatic, just duller, less vivid, less penetrating. They scroll through tragedy and feel almost nothing. They consume beauty and feel almost nothing. They hear important news and move on in seconds. They watch stories after stories, face after face, crisis after crisis, and somehow everything starts blending together. Even their own life can begin to feel muted. Food tasted fine, but not special. Conversations happen, but do not always land. Music plays, but does not always reach the same places inside. Rest does not fully restore. Entertainment does not fully satisfy. Pleasure is available everywhere, yet deep aliveness feels harder to find. This is one of the strangest emotional realities of the digital age. People are consuming more than ever, but feeling less. Seeing more than ever, but being moved less. Connected to the whole world, yet often less connected to their own inner world. They are not only distracted, they are being numbed. And numbness is dangerous precisely because it does not always look dramatic. It looks functional, normal, adaptive. You can still go to work, answer messages, watch videos, laugh at clips, buy things, talk to people, live an ordinary life. But underneath it, something may be quietly weakening your ability to feel deeply, to care steadily, to stay present long enough for life to actually touch you, to remain emotionally open without being overwhelmed. The internet did not invent numbness. Human beings have always had ways of protecting themselves from pain. But the internet has created a new environment for numbness to thrive, an environment of constant stimulation, constant exposure, constant speed, constant novelty, constant emotional switching, a place where the mind is flooded so often that death becomes harder, a place where the nervous system learns to skim reality instead of inhabit it, a place where too much feeling is triggered too quickly, too often, and eventually the system begins protecting itself by dueling. That is the hidden cost. Because the internet does not only entertain you, it conditions you. It changes your thresholds, your emotional attention, your tolerance for silence, your relationship to boredom, your response to pain, your sense of meaning, your ability to be moved. At first, that may sound too dramatic, but think about what daily life now feels like for millions of people. You can watch a war update, then a comedy clip, then a luxury apartment tour, then a breakup story, then a fitness video, then a scandal, then a cat video, then a murder documentary, then an advertisement, then a friend's vacation, all within 15 minutes. And then you are expected to return to your own life and feel normal, to feel coherent, to feel grounded, to feel human in a deep and steady way. That is not a small demand, that is a nervous system on the siege. And when a nervous system is overstimulated for too long, one of the ways it survives is by reducing emotional sensitivity. Not because you stopped caring, but because too much has been hitting you too fast. That is why the internet is making many people numb, not through an obvious blow, but through endless exposure, endless novelty, endless emotional traffic, until the mind begins protecting itself by letting less and less truly land. And when less lands, life begins to feel farther away. Not because life has no meaning, but because your system is having a harder time feeling it. The internet has changed almost everything: how we communicate, how we learn, how we work, how we shop, how we relax, how we date, how we form opinions, how we see other people, how we see ourselves. It has given us extraordinary convenience, instant access to information, connection across continents, education on demand, endless entertainment, unlimited content. And in many ways, this has made life easier. But every powerful system changes more than the surface of life. It also changed the inner habits of the people living inside it. And one of the deepest changes the internet may be creating is emotional dueling, a slow weakening of depth, a gradual flattening of emotional contact, a shift from feeling life fully to skimming life continuously. This is not always obvious because the internet is full of emotion: anger, outrage, humor, beauty, desire, shock, fear, empathy. But emotional intensity is not the same thing as emotional depth. In fact, too much intensity can destroy depth. If the nervous system is bombarded often enough, begins protecting itself. If everything is urgent, nothing feels fully important for long. If everything is dramatic, ordinary life starts feeling emotionally weaker. If your mind is switching constantly, your feelings often do not get enough time to become real understanding. That is why this topic matters. Because numbness does not only affect mental health, it affects relationships, purpose, attention, compassion, creativity, spiritual life, joy, grief, everything. In this video, we will explore how the internet may be making people numb, why constant stimulation creates emotional dueling, how this affects meaning, empathy, and presence, why the modern mind keeps returning to the very thing that is fattening it, and what it might take to become more fully alive again. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos exploring the high hidden psychology costs of modern life. Now let us begin with the most important distinction of all. What exactly is numbness and why it is becoming so common? Numbness is not always the absence of emotion. Often, it is a protective reduction of emotional depth, a narrowing, a dueling, a flattening of sensitivity. It is what happening when a person is exposed to more stimulation, pressure, pain, noise, or emotional input than they can properly process. The system protects itself by reducing how much gets through. This can happen after trauma, after grief, after long stress, after burnout. But it can also happen in more subtle modern ways through chronic overload, through too much exposure, through not enough rest, through constant switching, through endless digital input that never gives the mind enough time to feel, digest, and integrate what it is taking in. That matters because the internet is one of the most exposure heavy environments human beings have ever lived inside. You are exposed not only to your own life, but to everyone else. Their fears, their opinions, their suffering, their beauty, their success, their conflict, their drama, their self presentation, their pain, their entertainment, and all of it comes to you fast, without context, without pause, without enough recovery between inputs. In earlier times, the range of daily emotional exposure was smaller and more local. You felt to your village, your family, your immediate world, your own weather, your own concerns. Now, the nervous system is asked to metabolize far more. A natural disaster in one country, a war in another, a scandal somewhere else, a trend from another culture, a stranger's confession, a friend's announcement, a celebrity's collapse, a political argument, a product advertisement, a thousand lives flowing through the same screen. This changed the emotional climate of daily life. The nervous system no longer lives inside one clear stream of reality. It lives inside a river of fragments. And fragments are hard to feel deeply. They flash, they hit, they pass. The next one arrives. That means the person is not only consuming more, they're often processing less fully. This creates a dangerous combination: high emotional exposure with low emotional integration. And that is one of the classic conditions under which numbness grows. Because the human mind cannot stay wide open forever under constant impact. Eventually, it starts filtering harder, feeling less, letting less in, not because it wants a smaller life, but because it is trying to survive a louder one. Too much stimulation makes real life feel weaker. One of the first ways numbness begins is through overstimulation. The internet gives you more novelty, more intensity, more images, more sound, more speed, and more emotional variation than ordinary life can usually match. This matters because the brain adapts to what it repeatedly experiences. If you constantly consume fast, bright, emotionally loaded content, your baseline expectations begin to change. Now slower things feel slower than before. Quieter things feel quieter than before. Ordinary life starts feeling underpowered. A conversation without dramatic stimulation can feel dull. A walk without a podcast can feel empty. Reading a long book can feel difficult. Cooking a simple meal can feel emotionally flat. Even rest can start feeling boring unless it includes a screen. This is not because ordinary life has lost value. It is because your nervous system has been trained toward higher frequency stimulation. And once that happens, the ordinary world begins struggling to reach you. This is a serious loss because much of real life is subtle. Meaning enters quietly, love often grows quietly, beauty can be quiet, peace is often quiet, thought is usually quiet, presence is quiet. If the nervous system becomes too dependent on intensity, then the quieter goods of life become harder to feel. That is one kind of numbness. Not complete emptiness, but a weakened response to the ordinary beauty and depth that make life worth inhabiting. This is why many people feel vaguely dissatisfied even during calm moments. They have been conditioned by a level of digital stimulation that makes normal reality feel emotionally so insufficient. Now life must compete with the feed, and the feed is designed to win. It is edited, optimized, accelerated, personalized, and endlessly refreshed. Your actual life is not. Your actual life contains repetition, silence, waiting, uncertainty, stillness. The internet makes those things harder to tolerate. And when the person can no longer tolerate the pace of real life starts feeling less and less emotionally available. That is the beginning of dullness. Not because life is empty, but because the system that receives life has been overtrained for something else. Constant exposure to suffering makes compassion harder to sustain. The internet exposed people to suffering at a scale no previous generation had to carry. War footage, violence, injustice, disaster, illness, personal tragedy, public collapse. Story after story after story. At first, This can create strong emotional reactions: shock, empathy, anger, sadness. But when exposure becomes constant, something changes. The mind cannot fully grieve everything. The nervous system cannot fully open to every tragedy. The person still sees the suffering, but the emotional response becomes weaker over time. Not always because they are cruel, but because the system is overloaded. This is one of the saddest consequences of digital life. Compassion can be exhausted by constant exposure. A person may care deeply in principle, but repeated contact with large scale suffering, especially suffering they cannot meaningfully respond to, often leads to emotional fatigue. Eventually, the person scrolls past things that once would have shocked them. Not because they approve, not because they are heartless, but because their inner capacity to metabolize that much pain has thinned. This creates guilt sometimes. A person sees that they are becoming less responsive and thinks something is wrong with their character. Sometimes the issue is not character first, it is overload. This does not remove responsibility, but it helps explain the mechanism. The human heart was not built to process infinite tragedy at infinite speed from infinite distances every day while also managing ordinary life. When that becomes normal, numbness becomes likely. Because without some emotional filtering, the person could not function. The system closed partially just to keep moving. But when it's close, it often does not close selectively. It becomes harder not only to feel global tragedy, but sometimes to feel local life too. That is the cost. The same numbing that protects the person from overload can also reduce emotional availability for what is close, human, and real. And then the person begins living in strange states, aware of everything, moved by less and less. That is one of the emotional signatures of this internet age. Endless scrolling trains you to skim emotion instead of inhabit it. Feelings need time. That is something modern life keeps forgetting. Grief needs time. Joy needs time. Reflection needs time. Embarrassment needs time. Love needs time. Even understanding what you feel often needs time. But the internet is built around movement. Next post, next clip, next story, next update, next emotion. Before one thing can fully land, the next thing arrives. This trains the mind into a habit of emotional skimming. You react quickly, then move on quickly. You feel a flash, then it is replaced. You are surprised, then distracted, amused, then distracted, disturbed, then distracted. Nothing stays long enough to ripen into deeper meaning. This weakens emotional depth. because depth depends on the sustained contact. To really feel something, the mind often has to stay with it, to let it spread through memory, thought, and bodily awareness. Scrolling works against that. It teaches the nervous system to sample emotion, not dwell on it. This has consequences. A person can become very reactive, but not very reflective, very stimulated, but not very transformed, very busy internally, but not deeply connected to what they are feeling. That creates numbness in a subtle way. Not because there are no feelings, but because the feelings never get enough time to become real understanding. The person becomes emotionally flickering, momentarily affected by many things, but deeply shaped by fewer and fewer things. This is one reason people can spend hours consuming emotionally charged content and still end the day feeling empty. A lot happened, very little settled, and what does not settle cannot nourish. That is why endless scrolling leaves such a strange aftertaste. You have felt many things likely, but inhabited almost nothing fully. And a life both built around likely touching everything begins to feel thin. Not because it lacks content, but because it lacks depth of contact. The internet gives you so much stimulation that your own emotions become harder to hear. When the mind is constantly filled with content, it becomes harder to hear yourself. This is one of the most overlooked causes of numbness. People think numbness only means not feeling enough. But sometimes it also means not being able to locate your own real emotional state beneath all the noises. If you wake up and immediately check your phone, your mind enters other people's priorities before it has even fully met your own inner world. If your boredom is instantly filled, your loneliness instantly extracted, your uncertainty instantly interrupted, then your deeper emotions do not disappear. They become muffled, covered, delayed, and a life full of constant digital input keeps producing this muffling effect. You are always near something, a post, a voice, a message, a clip, a headline, a conversation, a recommendation. That means you are rarely left with a quiet enough space for your own inner signals to fully emerge. So the person begins to lose emotional clarity. They know they feel off, but not why. They know they feel tired, flat, irritable, restless, but the feeling is vague, hard to name. Partly because they have not spent enough full unfulfilled time with themselves to let the emotion become clear. This creates a different kind of numbness, not total emptiness, emotional self distant, a weakened ability to know what you actually feel because the environment keeps speaking before you can hear yourself. That matters because clarity is part of emotional aliveness. If you cannot hear your own grief, joy, fear, longing, fatigue, or hope clearly enough, then you live farther from yourself. And distant from self often feels like numbness. It feels like life is happening, but you are not fully inside it. The internet makes this easier than ever. Not because it hates you, but because its structure leaves every little room for interior listening. And interior listening is one of the conditions of a fully felt life. Without depth creates a strange emptiness. The internet gives people access to constant pleasure. Small pleasure, fast pleasure, easy pleasure, funny clips, aesthetic images, shopping, validation, novelty, sexualized content, entertainment on demand. At first, this can feel like abundance, like the world has become full of accessible enjoyment. But pleasure alone does not produce depth, and when pleasure becomes constant, something ironic happens. It often becomes less satisfying. This is because pleasure works differently when it is endless. It stops feeling rare, stops feeling earned, stops feeling rooted in life. It becomes lighter, faster, thinner, a stream of little highs without deeper fulfillment underneath. That kind of pleasure can make a person more restless, not less. Because the system is getting reward signals, but the deeper self is not always receiving meaning, intimacy, participation, or peace. So the person keeps consuming, still slightly hungry, still slightly unsatisfied. This is one of the hidden emotional engines of digital life. A person gets enough pleasure to keep going, but not enough nourishment to feel complete. That in between state is perfect for repetition. You are not fulfilled enough to stop, not empty enough to fully turn away, so you continue. And over time, this weakens sensitivity because constant low grade pleasure can flatten the nervous system's response to simpler, slower goods. Now, ordinary pleasure feels weaker. A good meal without a screen, a quiet afternoon, a meaningful conversation, a page of a book, a walk at sunset. These things may still have value, but they struggle to compete with the speed and intensity of digital rewards. That creates emotional distortion. The person begins losing contact with pleasure that deepen life and becomes more dependent on pleasures that merely interrupt it. That is not only a pleasure problem, it is a numbness problem. Because when the soul is fed mostly through shallow rewards, it often becomes less able to feel the richer ones. The internet shortens your emotional attention span, just as the internet can shorten cognitive attention span. It can also shorten emotional attention span. A person becomes less able to stay with one feeling for long, less willing to sit with sadness, less willing to sit with ambiguity, less willing to sit with remorse, tenderness, longing, or wonder. Why? Because there's always an exit, a screen, a feed, a new clip, a new stimulus, a fast replacement. This matters because some of the deepest parts of life require sustained feeling. Love requires sustained feeling. Mourning requires sustained feeling. Forgiveness requires sustained feeling. Maturity requires sustained feeling. Healing requires sustained feeling. You cannot rush these things without flattening them. But the internet trains quick movement, quick distraction, quick replacement. So the person begins to lose endurance for deep emotional processes. If sadness appears, they reach. If boredom appears, they reach. If anxiety rises, they reach. If longing appears, they reach. The hand moves before the feeling has had time to speak fully. This creates emotional shallowness over time. Not because the person has no heart, but because they keep living experience before experience is complete. That makes life feel less deep, less charged, less transformative, because the deepest transformations often happen when a person remains with something longer than comfort would prefer. The internet makes this harder by making departure too easy. That is why numbness spreads. Not only because of what you are seeing, but because of what you keep not staying with. Over time, the system learns. Do not stay. Move. Replace. Scroll. And a life lived like that becomes emotionally thinner. Not because nothing is there, but because almost nothing is given enough time to become profound. Being constantly online can make your identity feel unreal. The internet does not only affect feeling, it also affects selfhood. When you spend enough time in digital environments, a strange thing can happen. Your identity begins getting shaped more by performance, reaction, and visibility than by lived experience. How do I look? How do I appear? How am I being read? What kind of life does this seem like? What gets engagement? What gets approval? What gets noticed? This creates subtle self alienation. The person is not only living, they are watching themselves living, evaluating, framing, comparing, projecting. That weakens authenticity. And authenticity is deeply tied to emotional aliveness. Because to feel life deeply, you often have to be in it, not outside yourself monitoring it. But internet life encouraged monitoring, presentation, packaging, Even private moments begin feeling like possible content. Even identity becomes partly mediated through what the digital environment rewards. That can make a person feel unreal over time, disconnected from their own direct center, more concerned with how life appears than how it actually lands. That creates numbness because the self becomes thinner, less inhabited, less rooted, less embodied. This is one reason people can have endless digital interaction and still feel existentially vague. Who am I when no one is looking? What do I feel when no content is playing? What do I care about when comparison is absent? These questions become harder to answer when identity has spent too long in performative environments. And when identity weakens, feeling weakens too. Because a person cannot remain fully emotionally alive if they are living too far outside themselves. The internet can accelerate that distance, especially when the self becomes something to optimize rather than a life to inhabit. Numbness is often the mind's way of surviving a world that is too much. It is important to say this clearly. Numbness is not always failure. Often, it is adaptation. The system is trying to protect itself. If life feels too loud, the mind reduces sensitivity. If input is too much, the filter gets stronger. If emotions are being triggered too quickly and too often, the nervous system starts buffering. That is understandable, even intelligent. But protective adaptation can become a painful lifestyle if it lasts too long. What begins as disband becomes disconnection. What begins as survival becomes dualness. What begins as buffering becomes distance from joy, from grief, from love, from self, from the world. This is why internet numbness is so difficult, because in one sense, it helps the person function. It keeps them from being overwhelmed by the flood. But in another sense, it keeps them from being fully alive. And human beings do not thrive in partial aliveness for long. They may survive there, function there, even appear normal there. But something in them keeps knowing that reality is no longer reaching them the way it was did. That knowing can become sadness, a quiet grief for death, for presence, for sincerity, for a world that feels more real than curated stimulation. That grief matters because it points toward truth, the truth that the system is too loaded, too fast, too full, too always on, and that your numbness may not be proof that you are broken. It may be proof that your mind had been trying to protect you inside conditions that are simply too much. That realization changes the question. Instead of asking only, why don't I feel more? You've been asking, what has my system been enduring? That is a more compassionate question, and often a more accurate one. The internet making people numb is not only a private emotional issue, it changes culture. A numb population is easier to distract, easier to entertain, easier to keep passive. People who feel less deeply often react quickly but commit less deeply. They consume more, reflect less, care in flashes, and move on faster. Deep weakens attention, empathy, memory, moral seriousness, depth of relationship. It changes art too, because when emotional attention grows thinner, louder, and faster, things begin dominating more easily. It changes politics, because outrage becomes easier than wisdom, and reaction easier than sustained civic care. It changes love, because full presence becomes rarer in a life of constant pastoral attention. It changes spiritual life, because transcendence often requires silence, reverence, and depth, the very things the internet makes harder to sustain. This is why numbness matters. Not only because it makes people feel strange, but because it reshapes what kind of human beings are easiest to become. If the internet keeps rewarding speed over depth, stimulation over presence, reaction over reflection, then numbness will not remain accidental. It will become structural. And structural numbness is one of the saddest possible conditions of a modern society. A world full of information, full of content, full of signals, full of entertainment, yet strangely empty of felt life. That is not inevitable, but it is a real danger. And naming it matters because what is unnamed is harder to sustain. It's making many people numb because it gives the nervous system too much, too fast, too often, too much stimulation, too much comparison, too much tragedy, too much noise, too much novelty, too much emotional switching, too little silence, too little digestion, too little time for feelings to become meaning. This does not mean the internet is pure evil. It does not mean all online life is empty. It does not mean technology cannot be used wisely. But it does mean that a mind exposed constantly to digital overload will often begin protecting itself. And one of the ways it protects itself is by letting less through. That is numbness. Not always coldness, not always apathy, often just a quiet reduction in emotional contact, a dimming, a flattening, a sense that life is not reaching you the way it used to. That is why so many people now feel tired, overstimulated, and strangely hollow at the same time. They are not only distracted, they are overexposed. And overexposure often produces dullness, not because life has become meaningless, but because the channel through which meaning is felt has been worn down. The good news is that numbness is not always final. Sensitivity can return, depth can return, wonder can return, but usually not through more stimulation, usually through less. Less noise, less speed, less constant exposure, more silence. more embodiment, more real conversation, more boredom endured, more walks without input, more time with one feeling at a time, more life that is lived, not just consumed. That is how a person begins feeling again, not all at once, but gradually. All the system learns that it no longer has to defend itself so hard. That is why the internet is making you numb. And that is why protecting your emotional life may become one of the most important things you ever do. Because a fully alive mind is not built by endless stimulation, it is built by depth, by presence, by enough quiet that the world can become real again. So, what do you think the internet is numbing the most? People's empathy? Their attention? Their joy? Their relationships? Or their ability to feel ordinary life deeply again? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next deep dive into the hidden emotional costs of modern life. Because some of the biggest losses today are not always visible. They happen quietly inside the heart.